I mean, you might be wondering at this point, wait, did he assign us a anti-Semitic diatribe? The answer is, it's unclear. Okay, so in this section of the course, you may remember, we're talking about the question, why be moral? And we've seen some other answers to this question, but the answer that we got today from Friedrich Nietzsche in the first essay of the Genealogy of Morals is don't. Why be moral? Don't. Morality is for losers. Okay, so in order to understand how Nietzsche gets to this answer, we need a distinction. This is a distinction that's going to help us understand what's going on, but it's not a distinction that he himself makes in the reading. The distinction is between conventional morality, or the accepted moral code of a group of people or of a society, and on the other hand, some kind of true or objective moral code, the right moral standard, right? So there are all sorts of moral disagreements. Those moral disagreements highlight a difference between one conventional system of morality, or one accepted moral code, the accepted moral code of a society, and another, the accepted moral code of some other society. It's the distinction between the moral code of a given society and the one true objective morality. If you're religious, that's God's morality. Or even if you're not religious, you still might think that there is one correct moral code and that people that don't recognize it or adopt it or espouse it are making some kind of mistake. Okay, so one thing to understand about this distinction is that conventional morality is something that obviously exists. We might debate about whether there really is a true objective moral code. In fact, we're going to spend several weeks at the end of this course doing just that. We're going to debate whether or not there really is one of these, and there are arguments in favor and against. But there's really no debate to be had about whether there are systems of conventional morality. There are obviously systems of conventional morality. People and groups of people obviously think in certain ways about what's morally right and morally wrong. So debate about whether there exist systems of conventional morality is like debate about whether there are haircuts. Yes, of course there are haircuts. There are mullets and the bowl cut and other haircuts, right? There's no real interesting debate to be had about that, whereas there's definitely a debate to be had here. So these are not Nietzsche's own terms, but there is a phrase that he's very fond of and that he used in the reading that you will recognize, and it's a name for a system or conventional code of morality. And that phrase is mode of valuation. A mode of valuation is just a way of doing something. It's a mode of evaluating things, of judging which things are good and which things are bad, which things are good and which things are evil. So he's going to be talking specifically about two modes of valuation, and he's talking about conventional morality. He doesn't really seem to believe in this sort of thing. Or if he does, it's not what he's talking about here. He's going to be talking about two systems of conventional morality. One of them he's attacking. The system of conventional morality that he's attacking is the modern bourgeois European mode of valuation. How do you spell bourgeois? Like this. Okay. Bourgeois means middle class or upper middle class. So he's attacking the modern, that is the prominent at the time that he was writing, but also beforehand in Europe, bourgeois moral code. What's this moral code like? Well, for one, it's influenced by Christianity, and it values certain things in people. And it values certain things in politics. And then there are some things that it condemns. Okay, so this is the moral code or the system of conventional morality that he's attacking. Notice one thing about this moral code. It's yours. This is your moral code. This is what you believe is good. Look, here it is. It's you. You think humility and modesty and charity and forgiveness and kindness, you think these are good things, right? You might not identify as middle class and you might not be European, but you think that in politics things should be fair and equal and democratic. Probably. If you do, then this is your moral code. He's talking about you. Right? And you think that aggression is bad. I mean, and selfishness. Selfishness is bad. This is what you think. And he's criticizing this view, your view. Okay. How is Nietzsche going to criticize this moral code? He's going to criticize it by giving what he calls a genealogy. The genealogy of something is the study of its lineage or its history. So he's giving an origin story of that conventional system of morality. He's going to tell us where he claims it comes from, and something about that story about where it comes from is supposed to undermine our confidence in it. Nietzsche thinks of himself as exposing a fraud. He's telling a story of where something comes from and its origin, and once you hear that story, you're supposed to think to yourself, oh, I don't have to venerate this thing. I don't have to respect it in the way that I used to. This modern bourgeois European system of morality isn't as good as I thought it was. Okay, so where does this moral code come from? What is its genealogy? Well, he thinks it comes from what he provocatively calls a slave revolt. Now, he doesn't mean a literal slave revolt where there are people who are literally enslaved who rise up against the people who are literally enslaving them. There, of course, historically have been actual literal slave revolts. Like Haiti was founded by a slave revolt. It was a slave colony, and the slaves rose up and revolted and overthrew their masters. But that's not exactly what he's talking about. He's using slave revolt as a kind of metaphor for a case where the powerful, dominating group are overthrown by the powerless. And the way that this slave revolt works is that the attributes of the powerless, the attributes or the things that they value in themselves, they come to replace the attributes of the powerful as the thing that everyone values. So they've got certain things, certain attributes, certain features of them, the powerless, that they're going to hold up as good, and they're going to somehow convince everyone to think that those attributes are good and that the attributes of the powerful are evil. Okay, so how does this go? Nietzsche talks about two modes of valuation, two moral codes. One of them is the knightly aristocratic moral code. And the other is the priestly moral code. Okay, and each of these moral codes is organized around a different distinction. The knightly aristocratic moral code is organized around the distinction between good and bad. Whereas the priestly moral code or mode of valuation is organized around the distinction between good and evil. Nietzsche thinks that in Europe at least, originally the dominant mode of valuation was centered around the distinction between things being good and bad, and that it got transitioned into a distinction between good and evil. Okay, so you might be wondering, what are these two distinctions? Here's what he says about good. Okay, he says, everywhere noble aristocratic in the social sense is the basic concept from which good, in the sense of with aristocratic soul or noble, developed. Maybe there's a semicolon here, I don't know. That's the first part that we need to get a grip on. What he's doing is he's talking about the etymology or the origin, he claims, of the word good. The idea is that originally the word good referred to nobility or being noble, being rich, being an aristocrat. And that was the basic concept that we get the word good for. And that this meaning of the word good, it always runs in parallel with, well, what he then goes on to say is the common, the plebeian, the low, right? That's just what the term bad refers to. It refers to just the opposite of aristocratic or noble. That's where he says the word good comes from. And then he says that being bad in this sense carries with it, quote, no inculpatory implication. That it is simply in contradistinction to the nobility. Okay, so when he talks about the distinction between good and bad, he thinks that that's how these terms were used in multiple languages, and that they meant a distinction between aristocratic or noble and common or lowly. That's very different from the distinction between good and evil, where good in this sense means righteous. It means morally righteous, and evil means worthy of condemnation. Okay. So we understand the distinction between good and evil and how it's different from the distinction between good and bad. And he thinks that on these different modes of valuation, there were different sorts of things that were valued. On the priestly mode of valuation, the attributes of the powerless were thought to be good attributes. This is just what we saw before. Kindness, self-sacrifice, humility, modesty, fairness, that sort of stuff, that's good. And it's opposed to evil. But on the other hand, well, here's what he says is valued. The knightly aristocratic value judgments presupposed a powerful physicality, a flourishing, abundant, even overflowing health, together with that which serves to preserve it, war, adventure, hunting, dancing, war games, and in general, all that involves vigorous, free, joyful activity. Okay, so we've got some sense of what the value systems are. This one thinks that being rich and powerful and aggressive and confident and warlike, that's good. And what's bad is the meek and the weak and the shy. On this view, all of those traits, the traits of the common people, the traits of the powerless, kindness, self-sacrifice, humility, modesty, fairness, forgiveness, all of these traits replace these as the ones that are valued. That is the slave revolt. The slave revolt looks like this. Okay, so the situation is that we get a swapping of the roles or the places of the powerful and powerless, right? The powerful go from the good to the evil, and the powerless go from the bad to the good. So not only is there a switch in the roles of the powerful and the powerless, but there's also a switch from the good-bad distinction to the good-evil distinction. Now here's the thing. Nietzsche thought that this slave revolt, as he called it, was an actual historical event. It really occurred in history. And there were real people who held each of these modes of valuation, each of these moral codes. He thinks that you hold this one right now, and he thinks that this one was dominant a long time ago. It was exemplified best by the ancient Romans. And this one was exemplified best by the Jews. That's what he said. Remember this? This was a pretty provocative reading. You might be wondering, oh yeah, the Jews. He mentioned them a lot. Was this reading an anti-Semitic treatise that we were assigned to read for class? The answer to that question is, it's not entirely clear. So we'll get to that in a minute. In the meantime, the first thing you might wonder is, if this was a real historical event, if there really and truly was a transition from one to the other, when did it happen? His answer is that it happened over a very long period of time, sometime between the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks and now. Okay, so we've said something about where Nietzsche claims this system of morality, this modern bourgeois European system of morality, where he thinks it comes from. But that's not yet to actually criticize it. He does say some things to criticize it. The first point he makes is that it is based on a kind of resentment. It's based on a kind of vengeful hatred. The idea is that the powerless, the dominated group of people, they looked at the powerful and the dominated, and they thought to themselves, I don't like them. I don't like that. And they labeled all of the features of the dominant group as evil. And then it was only after labeling those other things evil did they label their own traits good. Nietzsche thinks that on the priestly mode of valuation, the assignment of values starts with a negative evaluation of others, and then only after that does it assign itself. That is, do the powerless assign themselves the positive valuation, the good. So this mode of valuation is fundamentally reactive. Nietzsche has three real criticisms of the modern bourgeois European code of morality. They are the following. It undermines itself. It starts from a place of hate. It is fundamentally unkind to the powerful. It doesn't forgive them. It is fundamentally itself a kind of aggression. Another way to put this point is that this mode of valuation preaches love and forgiveness, but it itself does not love or forgive. Okay, the second criticism. It is unhealthy. That is, it involves this kind of resentment or hatred, but it demands that one not express that hatred, at least overtly, so you have to bottle it up. And by bottling up that hatred somehow, one hurts oneself. And then there's the third criticism. It stifles greatness. There are people who have the capacity for greatness, but they have to spend all of their time caring for the weak. It also seems to be opposed to the kind of risk that Nietzsche thinks is required for the possibility of achieving greatness. That sort of thing. Okay, so at this point, one very common question is, how could it be that there was ever any conception of morality other than this? It might seem to you like kindness and modesty and fairness, these are just part of the definitions of what's good, and that's just opposed to what's evil. And it seems like it's impossible that there ever could have been anyone at any time who thought that war and aggression were good. But Nietzsche has a sort of answer to this. The answer is this slave revolt has a history of 2,000 years behind it, and we no longer see it because it has been victorious. So you say to Nietzsche, there couldn't have been anyone who really and honestly thought that war and aggression were good and that kindness and humility were bad. And Nietzsche's response is, that's just how deep in it you are. You are so immersed in the priestly mode of valuation that you can't even imagine that there was a time when it wasn't the only mode of valuation. Think about this. We read earlier in this course Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. That's an ethics book that Aristotle wrote. Aristotle was famous. He lists all sorts of virtues. Go in there and find the virtue of kindness. It's not there. The sort of stuff that we talk about now as being virtuous is not the only way to talk about good or virtue. Okay, let's talk about one more passage from the reading. Okay, that lambs dislike great birds of prey does not seem strange. Okay, what does that part mean? So there are lambs and there are great birds of prey. The great birds of prey, they eat the lambs, right? They're the powerful and the lambs are the powerless. So the fact that the lambs don't like the birds, that's not surprising. That does not seem strange, right? Of course they don't like the birds. The birds eat them. And then he says, only it gives no ground for reproaching these birds of prey for bearing off little lambs. Okay, wait, so let's take this one part at a time. So bearing off the little lambs. That means grabbing the lambs with their talons, taking them away, and eating them, right? I don't actually know if this is how it works. Lambs seem to me way too big for birds to eat them, but whatever. The point is, the birds go and eat the lambs. All right, so only it gives no ground for approaching the birds. What is it? It. It is the fact that the lambs don't like the birds. So the fact that the lambs don't like the birds, that gives no ground for reproaching these birds. That is, that's not a grounds for criticizing the birds. The lambs don't like it. Of course the lambs don't like it. They're the ones getting eaten. That doesn't mean that the birds should be criticized. Maybe, well, in this case, the birds are just birding. They're just birds of prey. This is what they do. They eat lambs. Okay, and then Nietzsche says this. And if the lambs say among themselves, these birds of prey are evil, and whoever is least like a bird of prey, but rather its opposite, a lamb, would he not be good? Right? So he's saying, if the lambs were to come along and say, oh, the birds are evil, and we, the lambs, we're the opposite of the birds, so we're good, right? Nietzsche says, if the lambs said that, there is no reason to find fault with this institution of an ideal. That is, there's nothing wrong with the lambs saying this. Except perhaps that the birds of prey might view it a little ironically and say, we don't dislike them at all, these good little lambs. We even love them. Nothing is more tasty than a tender lamb. Why do I feel so awkward doing this? Okay. I think this was a disaster.